Buon pomeriggio. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of the International Conference Parliamentary Innovations, updating the capacities of parliaments. The EU-funded project Inter Pares, Parliaments in Partnership, and the European Parliament, which is virtually hosting this event. My name is Francesco Ronchi. I'm administrator in the Capacity Building and Parliamentary Support Unit of the European Parliament, and I will have the pleasure to moderate today the second session on deliberative democracy, impact on parliaments. First of all, let me thank the many participants of the first session, in particular for the quality of the debate. Last week, Professor Nadia Urbinati, in a dialogue with Marine Khan, highlighted some of the most daunting challenges for parliamentary democracies, including the development of new tools of deliberative democracy. The establishment of assemblies composed of randomly selected citizens for parliaments. One of the objectives of today's session is to review some of these deliberative experiments and try at least to understand their impact on parliaments and parliamentary democracy. To this end, we have gathered today some of the most renowned academics, policymakers, and practitioners on deliberative democracy. And we have now currently more than 300 participants following this session. Thanks again for your participation. Before handing over the floor to our speakers, I would like to inform you that there is interpretation in English and French. Which is the Parliament 2000. I suggest that you can the event, as you can hear both, and then you choose the language, choose English or French, and you press connect. It's very easy. You can also see this on the floor to our first speaker, David Farrell. I would like to thank him, warmly thank him for his participation. Professor Farrell doesn't need any presentation because he's considered to be one of the guru of deliberative democracy. He's the head of the School of Politics and International Relations at the University College of Dublin. Amongst his many positions, is a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and he has been the recipient of many prizes. What is more, he has been one of the leading figures in supporting and carrying out the Irish Citizens' Assembly, which is one of the most famous examples of deliberative democracy in the world. Many thanks again, David, for your participation. Grazie, and the floor is yours. We have many participants, so please, it's very important that we stick to our schedule in order to have a lively debate. Thanks again, David, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, which I'm very embarrassed about, but anyway. I hope you can hear me okay, because your voice was breaking up a little for me, so I will continue to talk unless somebody tells me there is a problem. If possible, could somebody share my slides? I was asked to keep my comments to as short as possible, and I will endeavour to do so. So there's a lot of content normally I would go through, but I don't have the time to do it here. So if we go to the first slide, I want to start with a very simple diagram. The glass is half empty or the glass is half full in order to set the scene. And the scene is one of democratic crisis. We keep hearing again and again about democracy being in peril. Democracy is in serious danger. And there are lots of well-known, sorry, Siri has decided to talk to me. There's a lot of well-known examples of this, and I'm sure they have been discussed in some of the other sessions at this conference. The decline in turnout, so less people are prepared to vote in elections. The decline of established political parties, the fact that populist extremist parties are becoming more prominent, and many, many, many more examples that seem to suggest that democracy is in crisis. And what I want to suggest with my brief presentation is that I think that's too pessimistic, because I think it is ignoring a reality, which is that democracy does not stand still. Democracy is innovating all the time, and there are plenty of examples of democratic innovation. But the one that I am asked to look at, which is of most interest to me, is the rise of deliberation, and in particular, the rise of deliberative mini-publics. And you're going to hear more about it. In particular, I know when Claudia talks later on, she will be summarizing, I've no doubt, her wonderful OECD report that looked at the presence of deliberative mini-publics in almost 300 countries, 300 cases, I beg your pardon, across the OECD and further afield. There's also been some very good research by Belgian colleagues in what is called the Politicized project that finds examples of over 100 deliberative mini-publics in Europe in the past 20 years. So deliberative mini-publics is very much prominent as an example of democratic innovation. So if we go to the next slide, what do I mean when I say deliberative mini-public? Well, the first thing to say is that they come in very many different forms, and there's no time to go through this this very useful summary diagram, but you can always access the slides and find out more. But across the top, you can see the well-known examples, the citizens' juries, the planning cells, and so on, and of course, citizens' assemblies. And it's citizens' assemblies that most interest me in particular. So if I was to give you a sort of definition of what I mean when I say a deliberative mini-public, well, they're very carefully designed forums that bring together a representative subset of the wider population, and they're brought together in an open, inclusive, informed process of discussion on a particular issue. So if I was to boil it down, there are three main elements that a deliberative mini-public like a citizens' assembly includes. One is how the participants or the members are selected. It's a random process of selection, just like for jury duty. The same sort of process applies. It's a lottery, a national lottery, if it's a national citizens' assembly, picking a load of individuals at random. The second thing is, because they are randomly selected, they have different skill sets and different life experiences and different education levels, and they vary in all sorts of ways. So the second element is that the members need to be brought up to speed. They need to become informed, because if they're going to have this inclusive, informed discussion, they need to know what they're talking about. So the second element is the role of experts. Advocates and lobbyists can also be included, but it's particularly important that experts are brought into the room as witnesses. They provide briefing documents and they answer any questions that the citizen members may want to ask of them. And then the third element that produces the inclusive and open discussion is the role of facilitators. So the members of this deliberative mini-public are usually ranged around small tables with trained facilitators whose job is to make sure that everyone has equal voice and that any discussions are respectful. And these deliberative mini-publics can be extremely useful. They can be, ultimately, I think you can use a deliberative mini-public to discuss almost anything you might want to. But where they are of particular use is when you're dealing with tough, emotive, difficult problems where you need to take the politics, the party politics, out of the room and allow a process like this to have its role. So if we go to the next slide. For my final bit of comment here, I want to talk a bit about the Irish case, because this is the one I know the most of. And here you have a photograph of one of the recent meetings of the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland in a hotel ballroom. Sorry about the carpet, it's not exactly a very nice carpet, but otherwise it's a pretty regular hotel ballroom with ballroom tables that will have a wedding event in the evening, but during the day it's citizens discussing difficult and sometimes very emotive topics. Trained facilitators at every table. And the thing is, we've had 3 of these. It's almost over the last decade now, it's almost a decade. We've had 3 of these processes. The current Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality, which has had to go online because of COVID-19, is due to present its findings in the spring. And we've had a lot of policy outcomes. If you go to the next slide, just to give you a flavor of what has come from all these things. These are not just talking shops. They've actually produced important policy and constitutional reforms. They've helped to drive these reforms through the system as a result of their deliberations. We've had 4 referendums in Ireland so far. We were the first country in the world in 2015 to introduce gay marriage by a referendum. We introduced abortion in 2018. We have other referendums that are promised following the results of our deliberative experiences. We've had major reforms of our parliament, so it doesn't always have to result in a referendum. And indeed, our parliament declared a climate emergency a few years ago. So that just gives you a flavor of the outcomes that we've had to date. So if we go to my last slide, what I want to briefly talk you through is just where these sort of things can fit in. There are different ways in which a deliberative mini-public might be included in the process, but I'm just going to outline the Irish model, and my arrows have disappeared in the translation to your system, but I'll talk you through the steps. So step 1 is pressure for change. Let's talk about abortion. Ireland was in a deep difficulty in 2018. We were a country that had one of the most restrictive abortion regimes in Europe. There were only a handful of abortions that were possible every year. The government was being condemned by international agencies. It was told they had to do something about it, but they'd never been able to fix this problem. For government after government, parliament after parliament, they sought to try and find a way through this, to try and come up with some right for abortion in Ireland, and it never managed to get past first base, or if it did go to a referendum, the referendum very often was defeated. So what happened in the case of the 2018 process was that the Parliament established a Citizens' Assembly, and they tasked that Citizens' Assembly with coming up with proposals on whether there should be a referendum to introduce abortion, and also on what kind of legislation would follow if Ireland was to introduce abortion. So for 5 months, that's 5 meetings once a month, the Citizens' Assembly deliberated in a respectful manner on the topic, and they sent the report back to Parliament. Parliament then set up a special all-party committee that took 9 months to debate the report of the Citizens' Assembly and look at its recommendations, and they accepted the bulk of their recommendations. This was then voted on in the plenary of the Parliament, and the Parliament then called, the government effectively then called a referendum, which in 2018 passed by a 2/3 majority. It's a huge majority by our standards, voting in favour of abortion. So that's really where I end. It's just simply trying to give you from that example an illustration of how democracy doesn't always stand still. In this one example, democracy was innovated by introducing a Citizens' Assembly into the process of our legislative and referendum process. And it shows that we don't necessarily have to always think of democracy as in crisis, because democracy isn't standing still. Thank you.
Many thanks, David, for this very clear presentation and fascinating. We'll discuss this later. I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Farrell, so we can move to the policymaker side. Mr. Angel is member is currently member of the Council of the Group on the Future on the Continent of Europe. It's one of the figures to the public. of constitutional law. So it fits perfectly in this debate. Many thanks, Mr. Rangel, for your participation. The floor is yours.
So I have to congratulate all of you for this initiative, and also to thank to Francesco. It is really a great pleasure to be here. I will have only 5 minutes because I'm now in the council premises to negotiate a trilogue. That was the only day that they had and the only hour to have here the commissioner and the German minister. And so we are going to conclude an important reform. And that's the reason why I apologize, because I'll be very brief. I hope also a bit blunt, but I want only to say that I think that deliberative democracy mechanisms, and we have plenty of them, not only the citizen assemblies, of course, they are probably the most successful tool, and it's quite clear that that proved to be true in the case of Ireland. And by the way, is an inspiration for the Conference of Future of Europe, at least in the model that was foreseen by the Parliament. Probably we'll have an agreement before Christmas together with the other two institutions, but we are not totally sure that our model that would foresee 6 agoras, that would be citizen assemblies, and probably +2 only for young people. So 6 for everybody in a random model and 2 for young people, also in a random model. But we don't know if this will go really, if we'll be able to implement this. But what I would like to say, and that is my main, I'd say, doubt, is that deliberative democracy cannot replace representative democracy. And this is the thing that we should see, because today I see, even in some political groups and in some colleagues from different, I'd say, ideologies and from left and right, from radical parties, populists, and others that are not, some very well intentioned, but they are very attached to the idea of direct democracy, that with the social networks we are able to participate directly, that we really don't need parliaments, we don't need mediation, and so on. And that especially citizens' assemblies and with a set of referenda could replace representative democracy. And this is a huge mistake, because democracy is only a liberal democracy if we have representation. For me, today, the crisis, so I very much share this optimism of the half full, half empty glass of Professor Farrell, because for me, the crisis is not the crisis of democracy, it's the crisis of representation, because we used to have a territorial representation. But today we know that the sphere of power, the circle, the constituency where the decisions are made is not the electoral one, the old territorial one. So there is, I'd say, a kind of disproportion of non-correspondence between the electoral constituencies that we have and the environment where we are going to take the decisions, who is going to be responsible for the decisions. And people, when they vote, they think that this vote is useless because they are voting for some bodies or corps where the real decisions are not taken. So what I would like to call your attention to is that we should discuss, at the same time that we are discussing the participation of citizens, giving awareness of citizens, giving them the capacity to intervene and to be, I'd say, informed about the different issues that can really influence a decision. We should also think about representation in the future. How should it be done? Because we know that even the classicals like Aristotle or Plato or others, they didn't like democracy very much, but only because they had the example, especially in the case of Aristotle, that was a quite moderate thinker and philosopher. It was always because they only knew direct democracy and not really the representation as the main concept of democracy. So I would say that we should, in this debate about the participation of citizens, its real involvement, and all the models of deliberative democracy, we should be capable also of discussing institutional, how in the future we should present representation of citizens in parliaments or in different bodies for local authorities and so on. What should we do? Should we follow the path or the trend of direct democracy that a lot of people are claiming for? Or should we come to a more classical approach and try to link again the representatives with the people that is represented? And how we can do it? I think that, for instance, the Irish model, it was quite clear that these kind of assemblies were a way of shortening the distance between the representatives and the voters. So at the end, it was not killing representative democracy, it was enriching it. My fear sometimes is that with all these facilitators, we are also having sometimes the results before the assemblies. What I see, for instance, here in the European Parliament, preparing the Conference of Future of Europe, is that a lot of people that are enthusiasts of the conference, they have already the conclusions of the conference because they know what they want. And so they want also to design, to draw the participation of citizens in such a way that the NGOs and other organizations that really defend what they defend would have a kind of, I'd say, very, very strong role in shaping the discussions inside the citizens' assembly. So also here, it's very important to ensure the impartiality. We know that in all the deliberative democracy, and with this I will conclude, discussion, if you read all the literature, and it has 20, 30, 40 years, if we read this, we see that impartial decisions are always what we are aiming for, and that we can do it together with representation and also with deliberation. And that is what we should aim for. So these are only some concerns that I presented to you in a very chaotic way, because, as I say, I'm here now surrounded by a lot of negotiators to end what we call the visa information system agreement that will allow, I'd say, to have our foreigner from third countries, visitors, in a much more, I'd say, comfortable situation when they get in Europe after 2023. But okay, I thank you very much, and I hope that at least I was a bit provocative and this could enhance your debate, I'd say your deliberative discussion. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Rangel, for these very provocative statements and for pointing out the distinction between direct and representative democracies and the role that deliberation can play within this tension. From the European level, we can now move to the national one, and I have the pleasure to hand over the floor to Magali Plovy. She's member of the Parliament of Brussels, and she's the president of the French-speaking Parliament of Brussels. She's always been very engaged in innovating democracy through deliberation. So the floor is yours, Ms. Plovy. Many thanks again.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Interpares for the invitation, and particularly thank you to Jonathan Murphy for the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation and to the two topics closest to my heart, parliaments and democratic innovations, with a focus on inclusion. I'm pleased to see that scholars and experts in the field of democratic innovation have joined us for this conversation, and I look forward to the exchange we will have. Let me start by the two elements that shaped my work and that got me to where I am now. The first is my very first term as an MP in 2013 when I worked in the Parliament for 18 months. During this time, I started questioning the way that Parliament functions and more broadly, our representative system in general. I was able to further build upon these questions between 2014 and 2017, when I did a lot of work internally in the Belgian Green Party in search of alternative forms of democracy and potential opening to change. I work in parallel for the Center for the Fight Against Poverty, which really fed into my thinking about our democracy and those who had access to it and those that it left behind. It's really the combination of these two learning experiences that led to me presenting the text that would eventually create the deliberative committees. In fact, Brussels is a really interesting place for this democratic experiment to take place because it's truly a microcosm unlike any other. The diversity here means that we can act as a sort of laboratory for the European Union because we have a lot of the same obstacles. A complex stratification of decision making with a certain lack of transparency between the different levels and a lot of languages to factor in. This is what makes Brussels so singular and why an experiment of this sort done here has so much potential. So, in order to understand the deliberative committees, I think we just need to dive into how they work. A committee can be called in two ways. Either MPs decide that a citizen contribution to a polarizing public issue could be valuable, like petition that gathers 1,000 or more signatures can determine the subject of the committee. In order to participate, one must be a resident of Brussels and 16 or over. And the citizens are randomly drawn twice. The first time around, 10,000 invitations are sent out to residents of Brussels. And then, from those who answered, 45 participants are selected based on socio-demographic and geographic aspects, amongst other criteria. The convening of the committee happens in 3 phases. During the first phase, experts from various backgrounds address the committee as a whole in order to ensure that all members have an equal amount of knowledge on the subject and can enter discussions with an informed opinion. The second phase is the deliberation phase, where MPs and citizens sit down and change their point of view. And the third and final phase, write a list of recommendations for Parliament. If all or some of the recommendations are accepted, MPs that participated in the committee are then required to follow up on these recommendations within 6 months in Parliament with the rest of the plenary in order to stimulate the tabling of a motion. We've designed the committees to give actors who wouldn't usually have access to public policy a chance to have their voices heard. To guarantee this, we focused on inclusion, making sure that the committees are designed to come in aid to those less likely to participate because of various factors of exclusion. Specifically, we've targeted 4 groups. One, young citizens from 16 to 20 years old. The second, citizens that are the furthest removed from participation. Third group is citizens with a disability. And fourth, families. We've designed also a buddy system so that no fluent French and Dutch speakers are not excluded from the process. The big picture is that we are hoping to redesign democracy in order to better accommodate the participation of ordinary citizens. And we believe that this will lead to better quality, more ambitious and longer-term decisions being made, as those who are affected by policies are able to voice their experience. There is a need for citizens' participation in democracy to go beyond simply voting and also to reconnect citizens to their representatives in a more direct and stimulating way. These committees are also a way to help inner subjects move out of political deadlock and allow for citizens to contribute to the policy that affect their everyday life. Our final challenge is the aftermath of deliberation, so ensuring that there is a real follow-up by other MPs. It's necessary to establish clear benchmarks in terms of organization, inclusion, and follow-up. These are vital to ensure both long-term success and coherence within the process. We are also in full talks with government to ensure a follow-up on the recommendation made by the committees on their part. And now that I have presented the project, I'm available for any questions you may have, which I will try to answer in English, otherwise in French, because I've taken the liberty to translate the answers of some of the questions people usually ask me. But if any questions are not on my list, I will answer them in French.
Many thanks, Ms. Plovy. It's very interesting to see that some parliaments, like the French-speaking parliament in Brussels, have already integrated into their functioning tools these novelties of deliberative democracy. You were referring to the possibility of using French. I would like to remind all of us that there is the possibility of interpretation. It's very easy. You download the Interprefy application on your smartphone or your computer. You enter the token, Parliaments 2020, you mute the WebEx event, and then you choose the language. We now move to France. And I hope to French language, because we have the pleasure to have with us Cécile Untermaier.
Cécile Untermaier.
Bonjour. Bonjour à vous tous, à vous toutes et tous. Alors, il est clair que en France, nous n'en sommes pas au niveau du Parlement francophone de Bruxelles. Je suis députée depuis 2012. La France compte 597 députés. Je vais couper mon téléphone parce que j'ai des problèmes. Attendez.
Madame Untermaier is member of the French Parliament and she's very engaged on deliberative democracy. Please, Madame, sorry.
C'est bon? Excusez-moi, j'avais des problèmes avec mon téléphone. Oui, je voulais vous dire que nous n'en étions pas au niveau du Parlement francophone de Bruxelles. Bon, la France est très résistante à ces questions, nonobstant notre président de la République qui a lancé la Convention citoyenne du climat, mais il le fait dans une démarche qui est plus dans le souci en fait d'exercer un pouvoir propre plutôt que d'avoir à travailler avec les parlementaires. Ça, c'est mon analyse et je crois qu'elle est assez partagée. Alors, en France, nous comptons 577 députés. Vous avez le Sénat avec 348 sénateurs. Nous sommes, nous, élus au suffrage universel, les sénateurs au suffrage indirect. Moi, je suis députée en Bourgogne, en Saône-et-Loire, et je le suis depuis 2012. Et depuis 2012 et depuis mon élection, je ne suis pas une politique de longue date. J'ai travaillé longtemps avant, dans la magistrature en particulier. Et je me suis rendu compte qu'en fait, j'avais été élue sans qu'on sache en fait à quoi je servais. Et j'ai eu le souci, dès 2012, de travailler beaucoup sur le territoire et également à l'Assemblée nationale pour expliquer en fait ce qu'était le rôle d'un député. Je me suis engagée sur un non-cumul des mandats pour des raisons de lisibilité et d'absence de conflit d'intérêts. Donc, j'ai porté avec quelques-uns la loi visant au non-cumul des mandats exécutifs quand on est député, parce qu'en France, on a quand même, disons, la fâcheuse habitude de cumuler les mandats au niveau local et au niveau national. Et donc, on s'est résolument orienté vers le non-cumul des mandats, dans un souci de lisibilité et de se donner à fond dans son métier, de limiter les conflits d'intérêts, et également dans ce qu'on a appelé et qui nous est un peu revenu comme un boomerang, la République de l'exemplarité, c'est-à-dire le souci de développer la transparence, la déontologie et la mise en place d'autorités indépendantes, notamment la Haute Autorité de la transparence et de la vie publique, que nous avons mise en place à la suite d'une histoire fâcheuse qui nous est arrivée avec le ministre des Finances, Cahuzac. Voilà. Alors, à partir de là, moi j'ai développé, parce que j'ai beaucoup travaillé sur les questions institutionnelles avec l'ancien président de l'Assemblée nationale qui était Claude Barthelone, nous avions mis en place une mission parlementaire rassemblant des acteurs de la vie politique et publique pour réfléchir sur le devenir et l'adaptation de nos institutions. Et a émergé quand même l'idée d'un travail que nous devions mener aussi en relation avec la population, les citoyens, un travail en amont de la délibération des textes de loi, mais aussi dans son rôle d'application et donc de contrôle. Donc pour ce faire, moi j'ai développé sur mon territoire, et ça a été repris dans d'autres territoires, deux outils. Le premier outil étant un atelier législatif citoyen qui avait pour objet, par un appel à candidature, une invitation à tout public de venir participer à un atelier législatif citoyen qui pouvait prendre diverses formes, mais qui avait pour objet de travailler en amont un projet de texte qui serait ensuite en débat à l'Assemblée nationale, de sorte que nous puissions recueillir le point de vue des citoyens participants à cette réunion, éclairés par des experts, le cas échéant, qui étaient également invités, et nous donnant la possibilité de déposer des amendements citoyens. Ça, c'est le premier outil. Il a été réalisé de nombreuses fois, je dis une vingtaine de fois, disons 4 fois par an dans le cadre de mon précédent mandat. J'étais dans la majorité et c'était plus facile pour moi de les réaliser que lorsqu'on est dans l'opposition, mais j'y reviendrai si vous voulez. Ces ateliers citoyens ont fait qu'au Portugal, je suis allée présenter à l'Assemblée du Portugal ce dispositif qui avait retenu leur attention. Et l'actuel gouvernement en France, et plutôt l'Assemblée nationale, semble développer maintenant cet outil comme le considérant utile pour faire porter en fait les projets de loi qu'ils défendent et la politique que l'on défend. Enfin, moi, j'y ai trouvé beaucoup d'avantages. C'est à la fois de la pédagogie, c'est expliquer aussi la complexité des choses, pas faire de la démagogie, de la simplicité. Et puis, c'est travailler sur un rapprochement et confirmer que l'institution sert à quelque chose, parce que la démocratie est dans toutes les bouches, mais la réalité de son utilité, elle n'est pas perçue finalement par les citoyens de manière aussi évidente que nous le souhaiterions. Donc, ce premier outil donc, a été largement développé. Je l'ai traité sur différents sujets. Ça pouvait être le gaspillage alimentaire, puisqu'il y avait une loi en devenir. Ça peut être sur le cumul des mandats, là aussi, et sur d'autres questions beaucoup plus terre à terre qui pouvaient intéresser les citoyens. Et mon deuxième outil, c'est le Conseil citoyen qui, lui, accompagne le député dans son travail à partir d'un appel à candidature. Donc là, c'est tout public qui est intéressé. La crise de la Covid a évidemment limité ses effets. Donc, je suis contrainte à ne pas le réunir, et la réunion par vidéo manque, à mon sens, de beaucoup d'intérêt. Et le troisième outil dont je souhaiterais parler, c'est le jury citoyen. Parce que les parlementaires avaient, jusqu'à ce que ce soit supprimé, une réserve parlementaire qui leur permettait, pour une somme d'environ 130 000 €, de pouvoir distribuer cet argent sous forme de subvention aux associations et aux communes. Mais le clientélisme était derrière cette disposition, et avant même qu'elle ne soit supprimée, et je pense qu'elle n'aurait pas été supprimée si tous les députés avaient décidé de mettre de la transparence dans cette attribution. J'ai mis en place un jury citoyen qui a été tiré au sort en parité femmes-hommes, et qui a accueilli les associations et les communes qui souhaitaient une aide financière, et lesquelles avaient 5 minutes pour présenter leur projet. Et nous avons, pendant une matinée, une journée entière, un samedi, accueilli les associations, accueilli les communes qui avaient la possibilité de présenter leur projet de multiples façons, en tout cas de la façon la plus séduisante qu'il soit. C'est ce qui a été fait, et c'était même assez touchant et assez drôle par moments. Et le jury citoyen a décidé de l'attribution de ces subventions sous le regard intéressé, je dois le dire, de la presse. Voilà les tentatives donc de jumelage en quelque sorte de la démocratie représentative et délibérative que j'ai essayé de mettre en place. Moi, je considère que le député élu doit jouer son rôle, mais il doit à tout moment, dans le cadre de cette démocratie continue dont Pierre Rosanvallon a beaucoup parlé et dont je me suis beaucoup inspirée, je pense qu'il faut qu'on avance dans cette voie. Elle n'est pas évidente. Moi, je sens beaucoup de résistance, en particulier dans le pouvoir en place. Il y avait plus de volonté, me semble-t-il, sous le précédent mandat, mais je sens même dans mes rangs des résistances, en disant que finalement on est là pour décider, et que notre rôle c'est de décider, et qu'on n'a pas besoin finalement d'avoir la vie, d'aller chercher la vie pour soi-disant se rassurer, alors que bien évidemment il ne s'agit pas de cela. Donc on a un problème en France avec quand même la démocratie délibérative, nonobstant l'exemple qu'a donné au plus haut niveau donc le président de la République, mais je vous l'ai dit, avec quand même un arrière-fond qui m'inquiète, parce que je ne voudrais pas que ce soit au détriment du Parlement. Résistance des partis, et les seuls partis finalement qui évoquent ces questions sont des partis extrémistes, vers lesquels évidemment, moi je considère que la solution n'est pas celle que nous devons trouver. Voilà, je vous ai un peu...
Merci beaucoup, Madame la députée. Merci beaucoup, Madame la députée, pour ce dialogue entre pratique démocratique et aussi théorie. Vous avez mentionné Pierre Rosanvallon et sa théorie de la démocratie. Il y a aussi une question qui concerne la France que j'ai déjà reçue. Je voudrais dire, I would like to tell our participants that they can ask questions. We have already received some of them, but they can ask questions by using the chat. I think this is the most appropriate tool, or they can also ask for the floor, and I will by raising their hands, and we will try to give them the floor. I now would like to pass the floor to, so we move to a more theoretical approach, and now I would like to give the floor to Cristina Leighton-Bandera. She's one of the top experts in parliamentary studies in Europe, and I say globally. She's professor of politics and international studies at the University of Leeds, and she holds several high-level positions in the UK and in Europe dealing with parliamentary studies. Many thanks, Ms. Leighton-Bandera, and the floor is yours.
much, Francesco, and thank you so much for inviting me. And as David, I'm incredibly embarrassed with that presentation. So I'll just move on to what I was going to talk about. It's been very interesting this afternoon, and I'd like to come back to the topic of representative democracy and deliberative democracy, which has been a bit of discussion. And the examples from Madame Utenmeyer were really great to understand that actually we shouldn't think in terms of an opposition between representative democracy and deliberative democracy. And I think if we keep doing that, then we don't actually understand the value that deliberative democracy and deliberation have in terms of strengthening, enhancing democracy in general, whether it's representative or whatever it may be. And I think we are in a very critical moment, what I call of the mediator parliament. So the 20th century was very much the century of establishing the representative parliament, where parliament was done through representation only, and there was hardly any discussions in between. And with the mediator parliament, which is the 21st century type of parliament, that participation and engagement in that time between elections has become really, really important. And to think that participation should only happen, within particular representatives is actually to misunderstand our societies, to misunderstand the change our societies have gone through. And it's also, there's a risk that parliaments, if those parliaments don't engage with those conversations, that they lose relevance to their societies, and they don't lose relevance if they're not engaging those wider conversations. So I was asked very much to talk about why should parliaments work through deliberative democracy? What can deliberative democracy do to help parliament? And there's so many things it can do, and there's lots of examples of this happening. And ultimately, it's about enhancing their representative role, though. And I really would like to make that really strong point, that it's not about an instead of, it's about enhancing the role of our parliamentarians and parliamentary institutions. It's not about being instead of. And David Farrell's introduction already outlined specific cases for which deliberative democracy are important, and Claudia, I'm sure through her examples, will make those much more clear. But I would like to outline 5 clear ways in which deliberative democracy can help parliamentarians. And first of all, is by discussing and resolving difficult issues, which David has already spoken a little bit about. So those issues that party politics find it really difficult to resolve, either because they're controversial, because they're very emotive, because they're expensive. So things like social care, for instance, which is a problem of a lot of our societies, climate change, but also issues. There's a variety of issues where actually, if you think about it, the parties and politicians that keep heading locked and not really coming to a resolution. And those issues are often the ones that actually where deliberative methods and bringing in citizens is the best way to deal with those issues, to have a wider legitimacy with those. So my second point of why it can help parliamentarians is that deliberative democracy can gain public legitimacy into decision making. If you're about to make hard, difficult decisions, deliberative methods can help to reinforce the legitimacy of those decisions. Rather than being decisions made that no one really knows where they come from, it can strengthen them. And the third reason why it can help parliamentarians is that it can make the discussion of policy and of feeding into our decision making and understanding how policy and laws affect our societies can make that process more reflective, more informed, and more in-depth and more paused. I often say in this type of discussions that there's the campaign of slow food, and I think increasingly we should have a campaign of slow politics. There's so many problems that come from fast politics, fast information, polarization, all of those things. And if we can counteract those processes by slowing down, pausing, listening to the different points of view from one side and the other side, and trying to come to informed decisions, then we will end up with better societies and better decision-making processes. And deliberation can really help towards doing that. And then the fourth element in which it can help, deliberative democracy can help parliamentarians, is by potentially leading to better and more inclusive policy. So policy that actually takes into account the effect of a wider range of people. Because as policymakers, as you're relying on your civil servants and your supporters, you may get one perspective of a reality, but you don't necessarily see how it applies and affects a wide range of people. And deliberative democracy methods can help make those policies far more inclusive and can make them better ultimately. And there's quite a few examples of that. I mean, again, Claudia will speak more about that, but one of the recent examples that I think I would encourage you to look at is the Scottish Parliament, which has slowly developed those methods and now has a really good practice, really quite well integrated into what they're doing and saying, would those deliberative methods work better in a particular area of policy to end up with a better policy ultimately. And finally, the final reason to why parliamentarians should use these methods is to make them more relevant to society, to make Parliament more relevant to society, to make parliamentary debates more relevant to society. Because sometimes there is a danger that Parliament is moving forward, but it may leave behind society and constituents. Now, having said all of these things, I'm not saying, though, that deliberative democracy should be applied all the time at any stage, because it can also be badly applied. And I think it's really important to understand the principles behind it, to apply it properly, because otherwise you do have sometimes examples where you have a risk of these methods have been applied, but they've been done in parallel with decision making. They haven't been done linked to decision making. They haven't been done in integrated manner with decision making. And that's really important. The examples that Madame Otamaya, Madame Plovy gave are really great examples of how those methods can be linked to parliamentary work. There are difficulties with it, though, and one of the difficulties is the timings of politics, which are very fast-paced, very unpredictable. Sometimes there's resources involved in this, and sometimes it's difficult to bring these methods in at the right time. However, that does not mean that we shouldn't try more, do more practice, more pilots, more tests, and actually advance more our policy through these methods. And there's plenty of examples out there, and I'm sure Claudia will speak about some of those now. Thank you very much.
Great, Christina. Thanks, very clear. And you and Professor Farrell referred to Claudia and to her work in the OECD. So now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Claudia Schwalitz. She's a policy analyst for the OECD, where she works in the Open Government Unit. She doesn't need any presentation, I think, because both Mr. Farrell and Ms. Lechton Bandera, I think, have already introduced her work. So thanks again, Claudia, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Francesco. And well, thank you to David and Christina for mentioning my work already. I appreciate the kind introduction. So for those who don't know me, my name is Claudia Schwalitz. I am leading the area of work on innovative citizen participation at the OECD, which is situated with the Open Government Unit and the broader work that our team doing on open government, on civic space, on public communication, transparency and accountability. So I have 3 minutes and 3 messages to cover in that time. So I'm not going to do any justice to the over 200 pages that are in the report that we published this past June called Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions, Catching the Deliberative Wave. But I will hopefully give you enough of a teaser that you will go and look up this report afterwards. So my 3 key messages are: 1, that this deliberative wave, as we've called it, has been really gaining momentum over time. We're past the stage of experimentation and have a pretty good idea of what works. So the OECD report I mentioned has 289 cases. Also more examples of deliberative processes that have been underway since then. The earliest ones we have are from 1986 and they go until October 2019. And in this data, we really see an increasing use of deliberative processes by public authorities since 2010. These examples are from all levels of government. Without going into the details, we identified 12 different models of deliberative processes. So if you think back to David Farrell's chart at the beginning, that's a distinction between things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, consensus conferences, etc. So deliberative wave has really been gaining momentum over time. The second message I have is that at the same time, deliberative processes are not a silver bullet, but if they are designed well, the evidence that we have suggests that they have the potential for helping solve some collective, complex public problems better. So for this, what we're recommending at the OECD for policymakers and for practitioners is to follow the 11 OECD good practice principles for deliberative processes. Developed with a dual aim to help policymakers at the end of the day have a process that results in informed collective citizen recommendations on a complex issue, but at the same time for them to be designed in such a way that is fair and transparent and inspires citizen trust from the wider public. So that second point, deliberative processes are not a silver bullet, but they have a lot of potential if done well. And the third key message I have is that one key trend that we have noticed is that there is a move from just projects to permanence. So that doesn't mean a replacement of representative democracy, but a complement to it. And what we mean by that is also that rather than just having one-off ad hoc processes which are very much dependent on political will, politicians and civil servants are increasingly looking to institutionalize citizen deliberation so that it becomes a normal part of the way certain types of decisions are being taken. Because to echo what Christina was just saying, we're not at the same time suggesting this needs to be used all the time everywhere for every policy problem either. So these sorts of institutionalization things that I'm talking about include examples like the Belgian model, where the parliament in German of Belgium has put in place a new permanent the Citizens Council, which is made up of 20 selected citizens and power. Earlier, the Deliberative Parliamentary Committee, the Brussels Parliament. It also includes things like the new legislation that was passed this year in the Australian state of Victoria, which requires deliberative engagement by local councils for the development of their community visions, asset plans, council plans, and financial plans. So that's just a little summary. There's more examples of what we're talking about here. And at the OECD, we are continuing further work on this topic, writing a new working paper that looks at other options for institutionalization, notably actually how they could also enhance the work of parliamentary committees, which is, I think, where the link to the overarching topic of this whole conference comes in. So I will summarize my intervention with my 3 points of: one, that deliberative wave has been gaining momentum over time. We're really past the stage of experimentation and have a pretty good idea of what works. The second being that deliberative processes aren't a silver bullet, but if they're designed well, they have the potential for really helping to solve public problems better. And the third is to think about how do we make this a more permanent part of the way public decisions are taken so that citizens are involved in a deliberative capacity. So thank you very much. I'd encourage you to please check out the OECD report that includes all of this data, the principles, and all this discussion about institutionalization. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Of course, we will check it out. It was very clear, your presentation. And you mentioned some case studies. You mentioned Australia, Victoria. You mentioned Eastern Belgium, Paris, France. David focused on Ireland, and Ms. Plovy Magali explained the situation in Brussels. But I think it's also interesting to see what's happening in terms of experiments of deliberative democracy in contested polities, in fragile states. And I'm very happy to have today with us someone from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from Sarajevo. The European Parliament considers Bosnia and Herzegovina as a priority country and is considering to launch an experiment of deliberative democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina. To better understand the situation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the potential for deliberative democracy in this country, we have with us today Firuze Demir. Ms. Demir, she's an expert on deliberative democracy, and what is more, she's a political advisor in the Office of the European Union Special Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I would like also to thank the many participants who are sending many questions One has also to do somehow with Bosnia, and it's from Jeff Balk from Justice for Africa. And Jeff is asking, how can deliberative democracy support dialogue for reconciliation after fraudulent elections? And he mentions Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire. We will come back to this issue later, but now it's interesting to see what's happening also outside established democracies. Ms. Demir, the floor is yours, Firuza.
Thank you, Francesco, for the kind introduction. And let me also start by thanking the organizers, the European Parliament, the European Commission, Interpares and IDEA for organizing this excellent session to discuss how we can upgrade our democracies to better serve our citizens. After all, democracy is more than casting a vote and ensuring that elections are conducted in line with international standards. Democracies are furthermore always work in progress. It is a process that is never complete. And as negative developments in the highly democratized societies of the Western world have acutely reminded us, no society is immune to democratic regression either. Let me also add that I feel extremely honored to be among such a distinguished panel today, containing members of parliament, professors, and practitioners of innovative democracy tools who have already shared their experiences in how the growing gap caused by mistrust between authorities and citizens can be closed and legitimacy of policymaking can be increased. In comparison, I believe my contribution to the discussion today will be more humble. From a personal perspective, I'm currently at the very early stage of doing research in the applicability of these innovative democracy tools as a way to address deficiencies in liberal peace building. So I'm not so sure whether I will be able to answer the question posed by somebody in the audience, as I have myself more questions to pose than answers to give. And talking from a professional perspective, the EU office's exposure to the use of these tools has rather been limited, while the challenges faced in BIH society may be more obvious than anywhere else. Nevertheless, I hope that even this limited experience may provide some interesting entry points for discussion, especially about the potential benefits and challenges of using such tools in a highly divided post-conflict context. Each society is, of course, divided in their own way along ideological, linguistic, cultural, or ethnic lines. In the BIH context, these divisions are further highlighted due to the recent horrible experiences of conflict, which may therefore require extra vigilance when applying this methodology. For our office, the leading policy document is the European Commission's opinion on BIH's EU membership application, which was adopted in May 2019 and later endorsed by the EU Council. The opinion's 14 key priorities, together with the accompanying analytical reports recommendations, form the roadmap, setting out the deep reforms needed for BIH in order to open negotiations that will lead to EU membership. While these documents set out the required changes to strengthen the rule of law, to advance human rights, and to overall improve democracy and functionality of the country, which would ultimately also mean changes to the constitution, they do not prescribe the methodology on how to do that. This is entirely up to the BIH authorities to determine. However, many of these reforms require strong political consensus, especially since significant disagreements over some of these issues persist. Unfortunately, the country is often at a gridlock, unable to overcome impasse on the most simplest of matters. And I will not bore you with the plethora of examples, but just remind you that all in all, you can imagine the situation makes citizens increasingly feel hopeless that things may change. So how can BIH break open its many protected stalemates and shake things up? To find some answers to this question and get some food for thought, the EU office invited in September 2019 a mixture of civil servants, intellectuals, activists, and a mayor to participate in a training on innovative democracy tools organized by the Belgian Foundation for Future Generations, also known as the G1000. To give you a little bit of a background, the G1000 movement came about in 2011 as a bottom-up citizen assembly in reaction to the inability of Belgian politicians to form government more than a year after general elections were held. This is also a problem faced in BIH, 2 years and counting. Authorities still need to be formed at the level of the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina as well as in 2 of its cantons. This fact in itself made it interesting for us to learn from their best practices, not in the least because the Belgian model of power sharing is often cited as an example for BIH to follow. By the time of our training, actually, this bottom-up idea had already been taken up by Belgian authorities, as some already mentioned, namely those in Eupen, in the capital of the German-speaking part of Belgium, which had just started using an institutionalized form of a citizen assembly. And as we have heard today from Ms. Provi, authorities in Brussels are now also considering making use of it, teaching us that bottom-up initiatives can grow into initiatives supported by authorities at all levels. The workshop was very timely and useful as it provided best practices from across the world. Back then, the OECD Best Practices Handbook had not come out yet. And I really welcome this document, which shows that citizen assemblies are slowly but certainly becoming part and parcel of our governance toolbox. At the end of the workshop, the delegation we brought with us came to understand that in BIH there was even a stronger need to restore public trust in political institutions and engage citizens in debate on wider public life than the places where these tools had already been tried and tested. Nevertheless, a few issues caused our participants caution and made some of them think that such tools may have a limited applicability in the post-conflict setting of BIH. Firstly, because of the widespread cynicism about BIH citizens' ability to influence politics, and secondly, because of a general suspicion in BIH society towards anything that may lead to a change in the status quo, fearing a change to the detriment. In the context of the Citizen Assembly, there was a fear of misuse of the methodology to serve certain political interests, defeating the point of the Citizen Assembly in the first place. Indeed, as best practices elsewhere also indicated, the effective use of such tools required either the initiation or the support of authorities, which may be difficult to achieve in the BIH context, or in the least, it required a management of citizens' expectations on what will happen to the recommendations they would put forward. Failing to do so would only increase disillusionment. Also, absolute transparency on issues such as who's behind the organization of the Citizen Assembly and what criteria have been used for sortition, as well as a thorough and legitimate methodological approach. Sorry, excuse me. Something happened with my computer. Also, an absolute transparency on the issues as who is behind the organization of the Citizen Assembly and what criteria have been used for sortition, as well as a thorough and legitimate methodological approach, which was also mentioned by others, were deemed important to ensure a positive attitude towards the use of these tools. Inability to secure these conditions, we concluded, could do more harm than benefit. Nevertheless, our participants were intrigued by the idea and saw merit in increasing awareness about these best practices. Therefore, partially as a follow-up, the EU office, in cooperation with the European Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of Bosnia and Herzegovina, started preparations for the organization of a so-called Convention on Democracy. The convention also discussed the European Commission's opinions priorities from a citizen's perspective, which intended to also feature a panel sharing the recommendations and experiences of a small-scale citizens' assembly conducted in the age. But unfortunately, COVID-19 happened and we had to put things on hold. Organizing a virtual citizen assembly was not an option, as this exercise really requires people-to-people contact and real-life discussion. Best practices show that the social component of a citizen assembly is as valuable, if not more, than the deliberation itself. We had heard from people in other countries that participated in such an exercise that they dressed up for the occasion, taking great honor to be invited to provide their opinion and engage in meaningful discussions, often for the very first time, about what they think is important. Believe it or not, some stated that this experience to be as one of the happiest moments of their lives beside their wedding. It also led to new and unexpected friendships. Sounds very promising, right? Unfortunately, no initiative to test such methodology has yet materialized in the post-conflict context of BIH, which would have enabled me to provide you with clearer answers today. Nevertheless, and I will add the caveat that this is not necessarily the view of my office, I do believe that this methodology may provide opportunities in the post-conflict context of BIH as well. First of all, because citizen assembly, which is put together by sortition, could complement and potentially help overcome democratic deficiencies of the current power-sharing structures, which is based on ethnicity. With the right methodology, it therefore has the potential to be perceived as a legitimate public voice. Secondly, the political arena in BIH is filled with divisive rhetoric, with narratives that perpetuate conflict by other means. Using this method consistently might allow for a change in mindset and create a culture that may lead to an appreciation of consensus building in itself. And last but not least, in a post-conflict context such as that of BIH, distrust is not only present between BIH citizens and its authorities, but also within and between various communities who still bear the wounds of the war that was waged 25 years ago. The use of a citizen assembly as a side effect could help create social cohesion. It may serve as a societal meeting point to increase regular people-to-people contact, focusing on immediate concerns that affect all, regardless of ethnic background. So in a nutshell, these were the points I wanted to add to today's discussion. One might say that there are no shortcuts to liberal democracy, as it requires the creation of a democratic culture beyond the holding of free and fair elections. And they are right. But who knows, perhaps citizen assemblies may nevertheless hold the promise of leapfrogging a democratic transition. After all, to refer to Aristotle's words, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit. So if we are to become or to stay democrats, we need to find ways to make a habit out of engaging each other in an act of empathy and compromise in the name of achieving the greater good. Adding citizens' assembly to our governance toolbox for regular use, I believe, will exactly do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Firuze. Thank you very much for this very interesting, fascinating tour de force. I take it as an invitation, open invitation to Bosnia and Herzegovina and Sarajevo for all our speakers to follow up on this Convention for Democracy, which looks very interesting, not only because the European Parliament is one of the co-organizers, but also because I think it's really a great challenge. So thanks again. We are almost coming to an end to this first tour de force. Then I have received many questions. And I would like to ask Giovanni Rizzoni, who is the head of the international relations of the Camera dei Deputati in Italy, to make some remarks about the discussion and what we have been listening. You have the ability to be the quality, I would say, to be not only a practitioner in terms of capacity development and parliamentary support, but you are also an academic and an intellectual engaged in the issues of constitutional law and the future of parliaments. So Giovanni, thanks again for your participation, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for the invitation to this very interesting conference. Well, I will make only a few comments on this very rich debate. The interventions were really inspiring. And I think that I will start with a remark already made by Professor Farrell, that is, democracy. I wouldn't say that I am optimistic as Professor Farrell, but I think that we have to be realistic. That is, in the sense that democracy rejects the idea of perfect government. So it's true that democracy is always open to innovation, and democracy, in a sense, is always in crisis. So we have to accept this crisis, and we have to accept new ways of improving democracy, as it was discussed in our conference. Well, deliberative democracy can open an important way of enlarging also the parliamentary democracy. Some of the benefits that can be expected from this innovation have already been mentioned. That is, give greater legitimacy to decision makers, especially when hard choices are at stake. For instance, choices that involve values-driven dilemmas or complex problems or long-term issues that go beyond the short-term incentives of electoral cycles. Well, then other benefits make governance more inclusive. The strengthen integrity and prevent corruption, because you make the decision-making process more transparent, more open. Counteract polarization and disinformation. This is another benefit that can be expected from the use of the deliberative process within the parliamentary environment. And I would emphasize another benefit, that is, the deliberative processes can help enlarge the cognitive basis of parliaments. One of the outcomes of deliberative settings normally is that of allowing the participants to share not only their preferences, but also their knowledge. And so deliberative settings can have the effect of bringing out the implicit knowledge held by the people on one given topic. And I think that this is a very important feature in our age, when there is a growing reaction against expertocracy. We have already experienced this crisis during the COVID emergency. And we need to find new ways of combining specialized knowledge with common sense. Well, the deliberative process can help in this direction. And I think that parliaments must be at the center of the efforts for filling the gap between the common sense, the knowledge of the people and the science and expert knowledge held by the experts, by the parliaments, and so on. Well, of course, deliberation and deliberative democracy cannot be the panacea for the parliamentary democracy. And I would like to conclude with some final thoughts about the use of deliberative democracy within parliamentary environment. Since I am also parliamentary officer and I have all the day the problem of making things possible in the parliament, how to support the actual work of the members of the parliament. Well, first of all, I think that politics thrives on conflict and division. And it would not be wise to expect from deliberative democracy to expel politics from parliaments. Democracy and parliamentary democracy is a system that tries to manage the conflict, the political conflict, the division between, the cleavage between majority and opposition in non-violent means. But I think that we cannot replace this conflict through deliberative processes. We cannot presume to arrive to consensus like it happens in the juries. The juries, if they are not able to reach unanimity, they are not able to reach the decision. Well, this is not possible in parliaments, of course. So we have to cope with division. We have to cope with the conflict between the majority and the opposition. Then, second, political accountability is one of the founding values for representative democracy. The opening of new participatory channels should not be used as an excuse for shifting political accountability. So we have to make clear that the use of these new channels of participations doesn't mean to diminish the accountability of politicians, of MPs. Third, we have to avoid a one-fits-all model of public deliberation. That is, we have to take into account legal, cultural, and social contexts that really matter for the good functioning of these experiments, very interesting experiments as those that were illustrated by in France or in Ireland or in Brussels. And last but not least, leave room to experimentation. That is, it would not be wise to over-regulate these new channels of participation, and we have to we are entering in some way in uncharted waters of democratic innovation. We have to keep open innovation and experimentation, because I think that we have to adapt to new needs as those that are necessary for having a healthy democracy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Giovanni. You raised very important issues, and we have some questions on that. In particular, we'll come back now in the discussion to this point, the relationship between consensus and conflict. Is deliberative democracy putting too much stress on, let's say, consensus or consensual politics rather than conflict, which is the basis of politics, I mean, peaceful conflict. But now I would like to move, because we still have 25 minutes for discussion, and we have received many questions. And I would like to start with one very interesting question from Loïc Delorme. And I would ask Professor Farrell and our three first speakers to answer this question. So Ms. Plovy, Ms. Untermeyer, and even Cristina Leston-Bandera, if she likes. Loïc Delorme asked, Mr. Rangel highlighted that the host of the Conference on the Future of Europe wish to determine the outcome of the citizens' deliberation before it happened. And Ms. Untermaier highlighted that Macron is using the climate convention as leverage against parliamentarians. The host has too much power because he can set the agenda. How can that be resolved? Should the Citizens' Assembly be a permanent institution to prevent them only being called when it suits the government to do so? It's a very good question, and I would ask David to answer this question. I don't know if it's clear. I mean, if I read it clearly. I mean, but very good point, David.
Yes, that is a very good question, and it sort of comes to the heart of a lot of the comments that have come up already this afternoon. There are some who would argue that deliberative democracy should be an alternative. It should replace representative democracy. I certainly don't hold to that position, and I hope I did not give that impression. I completely agree with many of the comments of the previous speakers, including most recently Giovanni, that deliberative democracy has to work within representative democracy, and ultimately as liberal democracies, it is our job to elect the rascals out, to kick the rascals out if we don't like what our elected representatives are doing. And what that then means in terms of this question for me is that if democracy is representative democracy, then it is the job of the representative to set the agenda. Now, they can be informed from citizens, and they are increasingly informed, but it is their responsibility, and if they fail in that responsibility, if they use the agenda in an inappropriate way, then it is our job to kick them out of office at the next election. I'm not of the view that we should have a citizens' assembly that is setting its own agenda. I don't think that that is necessarily the best way to go. I think I'll stop. There's an interruption there, but I hope I've got that across at least.
Yeah, it's very clear. Very clear. Thanks, David. Ms. Plovy, would you like to comment on this point? The relationship between the host who's organizing this deliberative experiment and the participants somehow, and the risk that the host determine the outcome of the deliberation before it happened.
Je vais vous répondre en français.
Avec plaisir, je vous en prie.
Merci. Mais donc, c'est clair que pour nous, c'est très important la question de l'institutionnalisation. Donc, il était clair qu'on ne voulait pas avoir un projet qui s'organise en marge, donc à côté du Parlement, et s'organise une fois de temps à autre sur certaines questions et puis qu'on ne retrouve plus. Donc ça, c'était pour nous vraiment important et c'est la raison pour laquelle on a modifié le règlement du Parlement, donc le fonctionnement même du Parlement, pour faire des commissions délibératives une commission parmi d'autres du Parlement et que l'on peut donc activer à différents moments et de manière régulière. Donc il est prévu un budget pour l'année 2021 où on pourra organiser 3 commissions délibératives. L'autre élément aussi qui nous semblait très important par rapport à la question que vous posez, c'est d'assurer un suivi dès le départ. Donc pour nous, on se rend bien compte que parfois on lance des processus délibératifs ou de participation citoyenne et les personnes en réalité ne savent pas où on va au final. C'est-à-dire qu'on a peut-être des recommandations, on a des propositions de décision, mais il n'a pas été clair de ce qu'on en faisait. Et puis ça tombe un petit peu comme ça à l'eau. Et il y a beaucoup de déceptions des citoyens et parfois même aussi des députés ou des politiciens qui disent bah, « Regardez, ça n'a pas servi à grand-chose ». Et donc pour nous, il était clair qu'il fallait dès le départ dire quel suivi on donne. Et c'est de nouveau très clairement réglementé dans notre règlement. Donc comme je vous avais dit, dans les 6 mois avec les députés, etc. Donc pour nous, c'était vraiment fondamental. Et donc, qu'est-ce que je peux encore vous dire par rapport à ça? Je pense que c'est justement ce travail qui est vraiment dans notre règlement, qui va pouvoir justement peut-être être aussi réévalué, puisqu'on a un comité d'accompagnement qui va permettre en fait de voir après concrètement comment tout ça se passe et de pouvoir retravailler après notre règlement pour que ça fonctionne le mieux possible et qu'on puisse peut-être justement alors le reproduire dans d'autres villes, dans d'autres régions, dans d'autres pays. Voilà.
Nous sommes preneurs de ce travail, voilà, de formalisation et d'institutionnalisation. Madame la députée, Madame Untermaier. Donc, il y a une question, voilà, qui vous interpelle concernant en particulier la Convention citoyenne sur le climat du président Macron.
Oui.
S'est exprimé il y a quelques jours sur ce point-là. S'il vous plaît, si vous pourriez fermer votre... voilà.
Oui, c'est ce que je vais essayer, c'est ce que je vais faire. Sur la Convention citoyenne pour le climat, il est clair sur le climat, il est clair que c'est une bonne chose. Nous avons trouvé, d'ailleurs, les propositions qui ont été faites par les citoyens rejoignaient beaucoup des propositions que nous avions déposées en vain à l'Assemblée nationale. Attendez. Et sur l'institutionnalisation dont vous avez parlé, je vous rejoins totalement. Nous avons eu là dernièrement à délibérer sur le Conseil économique et scientifique, le CESE. Et nous avons institutionnalisé finalement cette chambre pour travailler avec les citoyens. Et moi, je me suis élevée contre ce dispositif. Je trouve dès lors qu'il serait exclusif, en considérant que toutes les institutions doivent être en capacité d'organiser leurs débats avec les citoyens. Et cela ne me choque pas que le gouvernement organise des débats avec les citoyens, mais je pense que l'Assemblée nationale doit aussi le faire, au même titre que le Conseil économique et social le fait également. Voilà, et je rejoins ce qui a été dit précédemment, à savoir qu'il faut que les règles soient posées d'entrée, que l'on sache où on va, à quoi ça va servir, quelle sera la réalité du pouvoir qui sera donné à cette institution. Et nous avions en ce sens proposé, dans un projet de révision constitutionnelle qui a avorté en France à cause de l'affaire Benalla, nous avions proposé que des pétitions citoyennes puissent être proposées à l'Assemblée nationale dans des critères et des conditions définis par le règlement intérieur et permettant à ces pétitions d'obtenir à tout le moins un débat en séance publique à l'Assemblée nationale sur un sujet identifié par ces citoyens dans le cadre de cette pétition. Je pense qu'on a, sur un Parlement ouvert, beaucoup de choses à faire qui ne le sont pas. Et je pense que la tentation qui serait de mettre les citoyens dans la main ou du gouvernement ou d'une institution bien identifiée serait dangereuse. Voilà ce que je peux vous dire.
Merci, madame. Si vous pourriez monter, s'il vous plaît, Interprefy au leçon. Merci, merci beaucoup. We have many questions, so I would ask Christina to start with another question. We have several questions on one point. We have one question from Zelian Baye, which is for Professor David Farrell, but I would ask also our other speakers to discuss it. And so it's about the role of political parties. So, and deliberation might undermine the role of parties, according to Zeliam Baye. And we also have another question on this issue from Peter Savlom, which is the relationship between party politicians, so politicians that are part of the machine, of the party machine, and elected politicians and office holders. And Peter Svadblom states that sometimes the problems with deliberative, with the crisis of representative democracy is caused by political parties with whips that don't want to give room to political parties made of professional politicians, because they don't want them to get a connection with their constituency in order to avoid internal party conflict. So to sum up, the issue is, what's the relationship between deliberative democracy and political parties? Conflict, complementary relationship. I will start with Cristina, and then I will ask Claudia and Firuze also to comment on that.
Very much, Francesco, and in many ways it sort of relates to the previous question, really, and it's the point I think it's really important to emphasize, and thank you for the question, putting it at the level of political parties, because we haven't really spoken much about political parties, but of course political parties play a very important democratic role in mediating policy between voters and governance. But what I would say is that I don't think it devalues the work of political parties. If anything, it could strengthen the work of political parties. And I mean, there's many ways you can see it being applied to. I mean, parties themselves can use some of these methods to understand better who what sort of policies their party members might be happier with, also in terms of consulting with a wider voters. So they can use these methods themselves. So that's one point. And then in terms of political parties' work within Parliament, again, it's about enhancing their work. It's not about substituting. So it's not about doing one thing or the other. And if you think there's actually, you know, a few parties you can think of, examples that have used these methods to strengthen their policies. And so I would really not see it as one or the other. And coming back to the point before about institutionalization or not, I think institutionalization is important as long as flexibility is kept within the institution. And again, thinking back to parties, different parties want to do different things, and we can't really say what a very large party will do in the same as a very small party. The issue of resources are quite important to consider here. So I think it's more about becoming aware of the advantages that these different tools, mechanisms can bring to enhance your work as a representative, as a member of a political party, rather than seeing it as an alternative. And the more you have those sort of almost like a menu of options that you can use and activate, like Madame Plovier was saying, it's about having that menu of options that you can activate and then use in specific situation. It can actually enhance your work very considerably. And for instance, and I think actually sometimes these processes, they are better implemented if they are brought in by a group of people, a group of different types of representatives. One example recently in the UK was 6 parliamentary committees which came together to do the climate assembly using citizens assembly. And actually, the more you work together with other groups, the more you can then enhance your own work, and the more you can build up the legitimacy of that decision making. So I hope that's helpful. I'm not sure if it touched exactly on the question, but I hope that's helpful.
Yes, it's clear. I mean, it's a very clear stance. Claudia, the relations between deliberative democracy and political parties as the bodies of political intermediation, please, if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really good question, and so we can maybe fit in one more question or two. I won't take too much time, and adding to what Cristina said, perhaps just direct people to some work that I recently came across by the political scientist Michael Neblo, who's been working with different members of Congress in the US to take some of these principles we've been talking about, but apply them in a different setting. So I'm not super familiar with the details, but from what I understand is that there's a random selection of people from that constituency that get brought together for a longer, more deliberative exchange with the member of Congress, because there's once again the problem of politicians then meeting with constituents in their constituencies, and if they're holding open meetings, then we all know that there are certain demographics that disproportionately attend those open meetings. So politicians are not actually hearing from the diversity of views within that constituency. So I would encourage people interested in that question to look up that work by Michael Neblo.
Comment on that based on your experience in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the relation between political parties, even in practical terms, and deliberative democracy. What is your feeling on that? Your take on that?
I think, of course, the whole point of a citizens' assembly is to find a way to increase mutual understanding for the diverse opinions in existence. Although it's not intended to change people's convictions and ideologies, it is designed to put heads together in finding common ground through formulating a set of recommendations addressing the problem that was put up for deliberation. Recommendations put forward requires broad buy-in and endorsement of the citizen assembly to be, put forward. And I believe that such a methodology will allow BIH politicians on their turn to share responsibility for difficult to take decisions. It may make them also more inclined to change their attitudes, divisive attitudes, and because they don't need to no longer to fear a backlash from their own constituency. So in that sense, it can also be, of additional value. So I think indeed it's not replacing party politics as such or the work of representative democracy, but it's a good addition into, building trust between citizens and their representatives, which, it's not only casting a vote once in 4 years, and that's all the type of interaction you have with citizens. And in countries like BIH, that is often what is the case. It's from election to election that there is contact, and this is a way to increase citizens' participation. Thank you.
Thanks, Firuze. I see that today we have been quite consensual, and quite positive, I would say. Yeah? So instead of stressing the controversial elements, we see the connecting, and the complementarities on that. But I would like to ask Giovanni, who had a little bit different approach, I would say, on that, more critical in a positive sense to that. So how do we deal when there are two different channels of legitimization, competing channels of legitimization? One is the electoral one, the traditional electoral one, on which party politics is based. And the other one is the deliberative one, which is different. It's another kind of representative channel of legitimization. It can also result in conflict. It's not that peaceful. Giovanni. Please unmute.
Yes, sorry.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. Well, Francesco, you are right, because combining different channels of democratic participation can be difficult. We have seen an example with the Brexit, that is a referendum, direct democracy on the one hand, on the other hand, representative democracy. And, how to find a combination between these two channels? Well, for the parliaments, I think that we have to be clear from the very beginning. We have to use deliberative channels in a way in which there is a clear, I would say, contract with the citizens. That is, we have to be deliberative by design, in the sense that we must have very clear at the very beginning what are the outcomes expected and the effects expected by the participation of the citizens. Otherwise, we risk to increase distrust by the citizens in these processes. So we have to be gradual, and we have to use on an experimental basis these new channels, because especially when we have to deal with democracy that are highly divided. For instance, the Italian Parliament, there is a very strong relationship, conflictual relationship between the opposition and the majority. It's not easy to combine this majority opposition relationship with the use of deliberative channels. So we have to be innovative, we have to be creative, but we have to be also gradual in order to find the right combination. I would like to end my remark only in saying that in using these new tools, we can strengthen parliaments, but also empower the citizens. We have the opportunity to engage the citizens, and we are now facing not only the crisis of the representative bodies like the parliaments, but also of the represented, that is the citizens, that they have lost trust in their own power to participate in the public decision making. So the opening of deliberative channels can be a way of reducing this distrust, of empowering people and empowering also parliaments. So it can be really a win-win relationship. Thank you.
So with this very positive note, win-win, win-win situation, I would like to give the floor for some final remarks to Professor Farrell. And there is one point I would like to point out, and is this idea of consensus. I mean, and the idea that, of course, on constitutional issues, a consensus is crucial in democratic system. On the rules of the game, we need to find an agreement. But politics, contemporary politics, is also based on the principle of majority, on the idea that even if you lose election for one vote, then you accept the result. And this is one of the pillars of democracy. So, and I go back to what Giovanni said in his previous intervention. How do we combine this idea of conflict with deliberative democracy? Many thanks.
Thank you. I'll have a go. It's a huge question. I think at the heart of this is information. So you have a better chance of getting some consensus if it is informed consensus. And actually, the example I'd like to go back to is one that Giovanni just raised now about the Brexit referendum in Britain. Because when the British citizens voted for Brexit in 2015, we now know they didn't know what they were voting for. And arguably, they still don't know what they were voting for. And that is, I think, a really good example of how not to run a referendum. That the citizens were brought into the room to vote on something, but they didn't know what they were voting on. And they are still debating now what they voted on. The contrast is when Ireland voted for abortion in 2018. Because you had a deliberative process introduced at an earlier stage into this whole process, the deliberative Citizens' Assembly did not just answer the question, should we have a referendum on abortion or not? It also went into considerable detail about what abortion would mean if the Irish citizens voted for it. You know, 12 weeks unrestricted access, for example, in the first 12 weeks. Under what conditions would an abortion be allowed to happen? Under what conditions would it not be allowed to happen? And when that fed through the parliamentary process, by the time we came to vote in 2018 in that referendum, we were informed about what would happen if we voted yes. We were informed about what would happen if we voted no. So we were able then to take that decision. It was still a conflictual moment because it was a binary choice and 2/3 of citizens were happy with the outcome and 1/3 clearly voted no, so they would not be happy. But at least they were informed. And I think that's the huge contribution that deliberation can bring into this, informed consent.
Many thanks, David. So this tour de force has come to an end. It has really been a very fascinating discussion. And I would like to thank, on behalf of the organizing committee, all the speakers for their valuable inputs. And a big thanks also to the 350 participants that have registered and have followed this discussion. On Thursday, we will have our final session, and we will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on parliaments. But for us, this is just the start, the beginning of a longer process to assess the impact of the changes of representative democracy on parliaments, and also to identify some innovative tools that can help parliaments to strengthen their legitimacy in these difficult times. So many thanks again for your participation, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you next Thursday at 3 o'clock. Many thanks. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye, Francesco.